book suppressed. And he kind of went, damn right. He was proud of it. The New York Times did a short story about its being suppressed. Why would the New York Times care about a book in Dallas being editable? It just left Dallas Morning News and going to work as the New York Times Atlanta Bureau, and he didn't have anything to write about it. So I called him up, and he did the story about my book. Otherwise, I don't believe my book would ever have been mentioned in the New York Times. But a small maverick publisher in New Jersey named Lyle Stewart read the story and saw it and said, I'll publish that book. He was a guy who was sort of stick in the eye, you know, he liked to do things that would tell him. So he produced 5,000 copies of the book. They were shipped here. 2,500 of them were up in a mysterious warehouse somewhere. Most of the rest of the remaining 2,500 were sold and circulated in southern Dallas. For a long time, I thought the only white person who read my book was my mother. Well, in my life, I'm sure. Although we haven't had a quiz on it. I found it one time in one bookstore in North Dallas, and the guy had it in the home improvement section. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, it's about the accommodation, you know. And when I told him what it was actually about, he rushed out and pulled it off the shelves while I was there. W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church and a leader nationally in the Baptist Church, group in southern Dallas. And in Black Dallas, the reception was always very polite. It was kind of, nobody ever said this explicitly, but kind of, we thought you had something new. and not only did everybody Black in Dallas know all this history, but they would get up and fill me in on all kinds of detail that I did not have in the book. There are holes in the book. There are no Mexican Americans in the book much, and my excuse for that is that I'm a carpetbagger from Detroit, and that was a piece of local culture that I just didn't get, and it's simply a big hole in the book. I always argue that we need a new book by a younger person who does not look like me. But the book sort of died down after a while, and I stopped speaking to anybody about it. I didn't get many invitations. The last one was from a women's book club in the Park Cities. It was about, I guess, 20 years ago. And they started late, and everybody had a little too much Merlot. So there was actual, I could hear snoring. And the woman who was the hostess introduced me as Mr. Schutze, which is okay, I get that a lot. And she thought that the book had just come out. The book had been out for 15 or 20 years. And she said, Mr. Schutze has discovered, he says, that we have a racial issue in Dallas. And I said to myself, okay, that's it, I'm not doing this again. I'm done with this book. So, 2 years ago, this young guy, Will Evans, proprietor of a company called Deep Vellum Publishing, who's become he's a very unusual person. He's become overnight, even though he's a small independent publisher here, he's become a deal nationally and internationally in independent publishing. He's now the publisher of Ukraine's best-known novelist. I don't even get how that works. I'm so out of it as far as how publishing works now. I don't get how a guy in Dallas is the best-known publisher in Ukraine, but it's all online and digital, and it's a whole came to me and said that he was going to republish the Accommodation. The reason was that young people in the city, he learned, I sort of knew this, I didn't know whether or not to believe it. Young people had been trading copies of the book as PDFs online. And, you know, spare me from ever reading a book as a PDF, but young people who had moved into the city, like the group who were in Norfolk Cliff, and here, all around us, I call a lot of them refugees from the suburbs. They were, you know, they grew up out there and they were drawn to the city. And they were reading this book. I had attempted to find out why, and I talked to some of them. And it was very interesting. They grew up going to high school in Richardson, north to Frisco, which is, I still thought of as kind of white flight land. And maybe it is, but it's very diverse now for the kids. It's American ethnically diverse, it's internationally diverse, all kinds of Chinese and Middle Eastern Muslim and West African and East, you know, all kinds of people. So in their schools, they were taught that all this stuff about racism and segregation happened back in history. And it was all over. And it had all been taken care of. And when they looked around in their classrooms, they had every reason to think, I guess so. Because their world was diverse. It wasn't economically diverse, but it was what you looked like diverse. And then they moved into the city. And why did they move into the city? This is going on in cities all over the country. There's a demographer who calls them the Seinfeld generation. They all want to live like Seinfeld, and not everybody can live in Brooklyn. So they're making their own Brooklyns in cities everywhere, and they're doing it here. But in Dallas, they came into the city, and they saw this Mason-Dixon line across the city, where you felt that going from one side to the other, you needed a passport. And it was very strongly identified with color, and it had a lot to do with affluence on one side, poverty on the other. And they figured, okay, something happened here. This isn't coincidence. We know, they told me they knew, based on their own experience, that people don't divide up that way by accident. Because people aren't divided that way where they live. So why are they here? And it was this wonderful curiosity that brought them to the book. There are other more scholarly books about this written about Dallas. I think mine's an easier read because I'm not a scholar. And I'm a newspaper columnist. But anyway, they were reading it and trading it around. And I think this phenomenon is really interesting in the light of all the debate now about so-called critical race theory, which is an attempt by a political element to shut off the teaching of our history. They don't want kids taught this stuff. And just in the microcosm of my experience with my book, lots of luck. Because young people are endowed with this wonderful disrespect for their elders. And they're going to find their way to an explanation of what they see on the ground as reality. Will Evans told me that he was republishing the book. I kind of thought, okay, it's your funeral, buddy. I had attempted it. Commissioner John Wally Price had urged me, he and I were closer when we were young, and he urged me several times to get the book republished. I said, I've tried, nobody will do it. He said, you do it. So I signed the rights over to him, and he came back to me about 6 months later and said, I can't get this thing published. I said, I told you that. Sadly, right after that, he and I had a falling out, a fairly bitter falling out over an issue that now, in retrospect, looks to me like we could have gotten around it, but we didn't. And so we didn't speak for over 10 years. So Will Evans shows up and says, I'm going to republish your book. And I said, I don't know that it's my book. I signed the rights over to Commissioner Price. I don't know where that stands. So he went to Price and he settled that. He came to my house and he handed me a check for a modest amount for the rights to the book. And I said, are you just driving around town giving checks to anybody who might have rights to this book? And he said, you got it. So both Price and I ceded our rights to him. Then he did this beautiful job of republishing it, really way more meticulous than the original publishing, which was tough for me because I had a bright young fact checker calling me up and asking me how I knew this and how I knew that, and I was saying, I don't know. This is gone. The book was physically well, beautifully used. He called me up at one point when the book was actually out, and he said, you have to show up at the Pitt Hotel Tuesday at 10 for your reunion with Commissioner Price. And I said, I don't have any reunion with him. We haven't spoken in over 10 years. He said, oh yeah, you're having a reunion with him Tuesday at 10. So I showed up, and Commissioner Price showed up, and we sat down and just started talking like two old guys who hadn't ever stopped talking. And we've been talking about it since. In spite of my falling out with him over this issue that happened in the interim, I still have enormous respect for his courage and brilliance early in his career. And he's still probably the smartest guy down there. I had a contractor tell me once, I hate it when my contracts come up and that John Wiley Price is there. And I said, why? What does he do? He said, he reads the contract. So that's the story of how the book has been republished. It's very strange. This all happened just post George Floyd. And so I'm getting calls from groups. I got a call from one business group that wanted me to take part in a Zoom meeting. And I did not say, you guys wouldn't return my calls for 20 years. One of the questions I get typically at a lot of groups is, why are we listening to an old white man about this? And part of me wants to say, I have no idea, may I please go home now? But there is a more considered answer to it, and it is really that, I didn't sit down and write this book with a big social agenda or purpose in mind. I just wanted to do the book. But when I reread the book, I realize it's speaking more to white people than to black people. And it's not a book about black history, it's a book about our history, our American history, our local history, and that isn't black or white, that's all of us. But it does have a special voice to white people, and that would take me back, just as a last thought, to the next question I get, which is, why did you write it? And I've thought about that. I wasn't a historian. Why did I write it? It wasn't, it didn't have any good murders in it. It wasn't the kind of thing that would sell. And I thought about it, and I thought, in some way, I was just a reporter. And reporters, we're a little bit, I think, like cops when we interview people. You listen for the anomalous response. If a police officer pulls you over on the freeway and says, do you have guns or drugs in the car? There are two answers, yes or no. But if you say, not that I know of, that's called an anomalous response. And it actually legally triggers their right to do more search. So the anomalous response in my life, I came from Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, the university town where I grew up was harshly segregated, and it was part of my life as a kid and difficulty that my father had as a clergyman in Ann Arbor. obviously Detroit has a brutal racial history. That's where I came from immediately. So, I came here and this city was racially segregated and had race problems. So does America. That didn't make Dallas the Lone Ranger. But what triggered my ear was that when I talked to white leadership here and said, why is Dallas still so formally segregated? Not just the line across town, but I go to these meetings downtown and they're all white, except for the guys serving drinks. I watch you talking, even within, I went to a Democratic Party convention when I first came, and there were white people and black people, but they sort of didn't even meet each other's eyes when they talked. There's a lot of this and that. There's a lot of segregation that's psychological. And I said, why is it still so segregated? And the answer, if I asked black people that, one of the answers was, there are reasons, and we don't feel like talking to you about it. White man from Detroit, which I understood. And other people like Zan Holmes at Community Methodist would give me a rundown on the history, but white leadership, if I said, well, why is the city so segregated? And I'm talking Bobby Folsom, Stark Taylor, the big developer guys who were running City Hall, they would say, is it segregated? I hadn't noticed that. And I'd say, oh, come on, what do you mean? Well, South Dallas, North Dallas? No, I don't go down there much. I didn't know it was segregated. And I thought, okay, you do know it's segregated. And it happened for a reason, and you're part of the reason. And so this is a story. Just like the cop would say, okay, I'm going to search your car now. I thought, okay, there's something here. There's some story, and it is more in this white mentality than it is on the other side of the line. We can talk about that. I think over the years I've decided I was a little wrong about that. I think Dallas is unique on both sides of the line. But anyway, that's my spiel on why the book was republished and why it gets here and why I'm here. The better part of these conversations, I find, always come from questions. So let me ask if anybody has a question. Yes?
So, on page 251.
I don't remember that page.
I'm going to read it to you, but for those of you who have your books here, it's talking about George Schrader, when the single-member districts came into being. And he wrote, Schrader believes, however, that the system will work against minorities when the majority finally learns how to work it. The minorities were better off, in his view, when the oligarchy was able to use the slate system to protect them. What's going to happen is that single-member districts are going to turn around and fight the minorities. They've lost the big ball game. This is a prejudicial, competitive system. People haven't learned how to use single-member districts yet. It will take another generation. And when they do, they'll use it for some very unwholesome kind of things. The lines will be drawn.
I had completely forgotten that quote, and wow, was Schrader ever in some of his impressions? In one way, this, was terribly patronizing to say that black people and Hispanic people need white people to protect them. I didn't see a whole lot of protection going on. If that's, protection, grab your wallet. On the other hand, he was absolutely right that it didn't take the Citizens Council and the Breakfast Club, and those other groups long to figure out, and that the guy who saw this all in advance was also a man named Lee Simpson, who was on the city council at the time, and went to work for the school district as an attorney. He said, they've made the districts too small and too singular, and in creating so-called minority districts, they've created really poor districts, and nobody's going to be able to organize and raise money in those districts. And Simpson said it will not take the Citizens Council long to figure out that it only costs $10,000 to swing a city council race in those districts. And then that $10,000 has bought you a vote on the council that's just as strong as the one that costs, however, hundreds of thousands up north. So that has absolutely happened, that through the financing of campaigns, the sort of the same group of people I call the oligarchy in the book have maintained a lot of control. I think the piece I missed, and it does have to do with my being, as my wife calls me, a carpetbagger, being from outside. It took me a long time to realize that, okay, white people here are Texans, but black people are Texans too. White people, this is a conservative city, and that conservatism doesn't pertain only to white people. Black Dallas is very conservative in many ways. And on a lot of issues, there was a sort of consonance of view between the old black leadership and the old white leadership. In fact, to this day, the enemy, the common enemy, is the progressives in the center of the city, in this district and others. Both the old elected black leadership and the old business-based white leadership view progressives as a common foe. So I think Schrader was right, that it didn't take the rich, powerful people long to figure out how to get into those South Dallas districts and influence them. He was certainly wrong in his view that anybody was protecting anybody before. And some credence has to be given to the fact that it takes two to tango at a certain point. This partnership between Black Dallas leadership and the wealthy white leadership is not simply imposed on black leadership. It's consensual to some degree. So things are complicated, but it's true. But what were we going to do if we didn't have single member districts? When I first went to City Hall, Willie Cawthron was on the city council. He had been on the council before under the at-large system, where you were appointed by the Citizens Council. And now he was representing East Dallas Lakewood under the single-member district system. And Willie and I became, we talked all the time over the years. I have a great affection for Willie, but he's of a certain stamp. So the first time I met Willie, I forget what the issue was, but I was like a week out of Detroit. And I was asking him about it, and he said, come here, come down this hallway, because we can't talk about this in the council chamber. So I went down the hallway, and he said, listen, you don't know what's going on. We had this thing imposed on us by the courts called single-member districts. And he said, now, I got people in my district, normal, you would think, Lakewood people, who are coming to me and telling me if I don't do what they want, they're going to vote me out. And he said, I talked to the city attorney, and he says they can do it. I thought, what is this man talking about? Isn't this democracy? But it was a new concept, and we had to, we had to go in that direction, whether it worked perfectly or not. Yes?
One of the most fascinating things I learned in this was the advertising campaign by Sam Bloom,
Yeah.
the desegregation campaign. I was like in the 4th grade in Tyler, Texas.
Uh-huh.
But I can remember that era, and that just, I can't believe the intensive effort to deliver that film to all the
Right.
corporations and businesses.
And the fact that something Stanley Marcus said to me when I interviewed him about this, he said, the the campaign was impressive and sort of amazing that leadership came together and did it. He said the more amazing thing was that Dallas, this partially segregated city forever and ever, saw this message from the top and kind of went, okay. that Dallas was so obedient in some ways in response to the campaign.
I don't remember the campaign. Could you refresh my memory?
I think this was pre-assassination, was it not? It was 50s.
I think it was 64.
64, right after. That's right. Right after the assassination, they had all these plans along the Trinity River, all, for levees and clearing out minority neighborhoods, pushing black homeowners out of their houses in West Dallas, all these big plans, all of which depended on huge federal grants. And after the assassination, the congressional delegation sort of called home and said, the well is dry for Dallas. The country hates you. They think you killed Kennedy. And we can't get a nickel out of anybody unless we can find a way around this. And so the story I got was that the sort of old, more Gentile leadership went, because, Jewish leadership in Dallas goes back as far back as the Gentiles do. It all goes back to Cotton. And went to people like Marcus and others and said, what are we going to do? This assassination thing is about to really harm us financially. And Marcus told me, well, the first thing you want to do is be smart enough to realize that we have a bullseye on us for the next Little Rock. Everybody would love to come here and make a big, bloody example of this city. And so we have to get out front of that and aggressively ward it off. And so the first thing we're going to do is put the word out. The schools are going to desegregate, and there's not going to be any trouble over it. And this is what, these are the marching orders. And so they created this movie that was shown all over the city. Walter Cronkite was the narrator. And, who is the publisher of the Times Herald? Anyway, he spoke, and Jim Chambers and the guy just beneath him, others. Jim Chambers spoke, and all the white leadership spoke. There was not a black face in the whole movie. It was all white people saying, we are not going to have any trouble over the schools. And then Marcus, as his piece, very symbolically desegregated the Zodiac room. And I always thought, when somebody first told me that said they desegregated the Zodiac room, is that like in the pyramids or something? I didn't know what they meant. But it was so important symbolically to the city. And they probably effectively saw to it that it was kind of a way of saying, forget about coming here and making us Little Rock. We're in front of that. And Little Rock, I have a good friend whose dad was dean of the Episcopal Cathedral of Little Rock when all that happened. And so his father knew all the people of Little Rock. And he said Little Rock just walked into it, just kept inviting it to get worse and worse. And Dallas did just the opposite. Of course, Dallas had the advantage of 6 years after Little Rock. But that ad campaign was fairly amazing and very propagandistic. I mean, it had this tone. Putin wishes he could do a movie like that. It was fascinating.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Yes, Bill.
So, I thought it was really interesting. You said this book came out republished after the George Floyd situation. You think about, kind of one of the premises of the book, I think, is there was this deal made, we're not gonna have violence in the city, you know, and consequently, there wasn't real political change either. And I
Right.
wondered what you were thinking when these protests and insurrections
The
really took over.
post George Floyd,
Yeah.
you know, I just recently, I think a week ago, called Judge Eric Moye, because Eric and I were, he was a guest columnist for the Times Herald, and so, yeah, we knew each other as young guys and we argued a lot. But I've always known, if nothing else about Eric, he's smart and he will tell me exactly how he feels. So I called him up and I said, Eric, am I being played sort of here? If there's a corporate entity out there, like this Chamber of Commerce thing that invited me to speak, and they want to get right post George Floyd, what would be safer than asking this old white guy to show up? And he sort of laughed and he said, Jim, you have to accept progress at some point. You know, you have to realize, you have to think about how different this is from when you and I were starting out in this city. And it's true. The CEO of the Citizens Council now, instead of being Alex Bickley, is Kelvin Walker, an African-American guy from Atlanta, who has shown up at some of my book events. The recent past chairman of the board is Fred Perpall, who's CEO of Beck Construction, who's black. There's just huge change since then. And then again, when I look at young people are just such a different species. This is one of my favorite recent stories. I interviewed this young white guy who grew up in Frisco. And he said, he's one of these kids, young men, who told me that when he went to high school, he went to school with everybody of every type. But his dad was a big racist. So when he was 8, his father sat him and his sister down and said, look, you kids are bringing home these colored kids and acting like we're equal. And you need to understand that we're white and we're smarter than they are. So he said that as an 8-year-old, he was thinking, my best friend at school, David, is black. David is like 5 times smarter than me. He thought, I must not be white. And I even wonder, you know, North Dallas, that whole realm up here over to Fort Worth is where a lot of this spooky anti-school board mobilization is coming up. And I went to lunch with one of the people who was an early leader in that stuff. And she told me all this crazy conspiratorial stuff. She believes, her group believes, that the public schools use code words to sort of hypnotize the children like voodoo, and that they're depriving the children of their identity. And I bet it's that the kids just come home and white isn't working for them the same way it does for the parents. And the parents don't get why. And so they've come up with this whole scary theory about the schools are practicing voodoo on our children. Yes.
So has your book been banned in any of the schools in the Dallas area?
You know what? It was banned in every school forever and ever initially. Will Evans has raised $250,000. He was very careful to come in and say, you get none of this, Jim. And it all goes, and they're going to print, and they're distributing the book all throughout the school system.
Just in Dallas?
Yeah.
Every junior and senior, isn't it?
Yeah,
Really?
it's
In
so
DISD.
amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just that, and that's a thing that Moyer brought up too. He said, Schutze, is this not progress to you? And obviously it is.
Yeah, the idea of you speaking at the Knights of Matthias Temple, this building that was
Yeah.
built by a black architect, and, you know, like all the leaders of the city were in that
Yeah.
room that night. That's as opposed to burning up a warehouse. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, I still get the question, when I spoke to this North Dallas Chamber, whatever they were, it was a Zoom thing, and I said, look, I often, at the beginning of these meetings, somebody asked me, why are we listening to an old white man about this? And the chairman of the group said, well, Mr. Schutze, I can assure you, no one in this group would ask you a question like that. And this black guy in the group said, I was just about to ask you. So there's still that to deal with. Yes, you had another.
So I listened to a presentation you gave online, and you said that you were, in that presentation, you said you're cautiously optimistic about the future and change. So what would make you what would have to happen to make you more than cautiously optimistic?
Well, I can explain this even though Mary Ann's present. Some years ago, when I first started going out and meeting these young people who were trading the book around, and I started getting to know the North Oak Cliff crowd, and Scott Griggs and his wife and so on. And I thought, these people are so different, and they're so great. It's not just on racial issues. They can solve problems like bike lanes and gardens because they don't have all these barriers. And I came home and I said to Mariana, if somebody my age has a sudden burst of optimism, is that one of those 7 deadly warning signs they have on TV? And she asked me why I was worried, and I said, well, they say, you know, sudden change in personality. For me, that would be getting a good personality. And she said she saw no immediate danger there. She would keep me posted. But I'm really optimistic when I look at young people. I think that they just have such a different view of the world, and it changes. You know, I've covered the world mostly in my journalistic career from the level of stormwater runoff and curb repair and, you know, these urban issues, which are insoluble, cannot be resolved if the people on the two sides of the table look at each other as Martians. But when all of a sudden everybody's kind of on the same page and there's this mutual respect, all this stuff can be fixed. And it's just, it does make me optimistic.
I'd like to know a little bit about your knowledge of and opinion of the big new park that's being planned at Fair Park on the very land that was taken away from all the black families in the 60s. And now, I read an article about a month ago. The article came out about the nonprofit that was raising money, 80 million or something, and the park was supposed to be finished by 2024. Are you up on that? Or?
I'm not. I'm really sure I'm out of it at this point. I haven't been keeping up. I hope that.
Do you mean the one in a cliff by the zoo?
It's supposed to be
No,
a fair park.
Fair park.
Fair park. A big, huge park, and supposedly they're going to have historical reference sites to what actually happened around Fair Park and the history of the state fair.
And to create an
Also
engagement.
planning hiking trails and gardens and music stages and farmers market. It's like a big, huge deal.
More like opening Fair Park to the neighbors around it instead of shutting it off, and creating an engagement. And I don't know. Fair Park is such a difficult issue. We just missed having it given away. So at least it's still in public hands. And I'm not up to date on what's going on now. Yes?
When I finished reading the book, I said to my husband, wow, this last part is like a
a Valentine to Peter Johnson. It's like he rode in on a white horse.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that really, what if he hadn't come?
Well, you know, history is so weird in that way. What is the author of the book, Parting the Waters? He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author.
Taylor Branch.
Taylor Branch.
Yes, Taylor Branch's book. When I started reading Taylor Branch's books about the national civil rights history, it reminded me that things have a lot to do with who's there and serendipity and coincidence and so on. The people who were in Atlanta, the people who came together. And Peter he was really seminal in turning things around in Dallas. That was an interesting, for those of you who don't know, Peter Johnson was sent here after the assassination of MLK Jr. He had been a foot soldier in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at King's side throughout the civil rights years. Peter still has internal injuries that he suffered on the bridge at Selma. And when King died, Coretta was left financially bereft. And so the SCLC created this movie to be shown around the country as a fundraising thing for her. And they sent Peter to Dallas, which they considered to be their worst assignment. And they said, show the movie and get out of town. And Peter, don't get involved in anything. Because Peter had a tendency to get into trouble wherever he went. So he came, he had a lot of difficulty getting the movie shown. Finally, he got it shown. But while he was here, there was this effort going on by the city to simply scrape the black neighborhood around Fair Park using eminent domain. And the city's rule was, we have to pay market value. So on the streets bordering Fair Park, there were black owners and black-owned businesses, but there were also white owners. And so the city said, the market value for the white properties is much higher because they're white. And even though you have exactly the same commercial building or house next door, you know, your value is a lot less because you're black. We have to go by, we have to be real about this. So Peter knew that the Supreme Court had sort of knocked all that down. They had already knocked down the deed restrictions, and they had somehow set the rules so that no, you have to, with eminent domain, you gotta go by equivalencies on the ground. And he said that nobody in the black community realized that, and nobody in the white community was letting on to it. So we called back to Atlanta. They said, Peter, get out of town. Bring us the money. Do not stay there. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't leave. So he led a hunger strike on City Hall steps. He lost a lot of weight. He told me this hilarious story of Al Lipscomb showing up at the hunger strike, handing him a thermos, and Peter unscrewed it a little bit and smelled beef stew. And so he took Al around the corner and said, Al, this is a hunger strike. I can't eat beef stew. I get caught. That kind of ruins the whole thing. And Al said, well, yeah, but I don't want you to starve to death. So there was a lot of teaching going on that Peter was doing. And he was very effective. And he organized, he finally threatened to, you know, they were going to have the first Cotton Bowl parade televised by the networks. And Peter threatened to stop the parade on TV. And so finally, J. Eric Johnson, the mayor, angrily agreed to some terms. And Peter said, I also want a black presence in the parade. And Johnson said, okay, you can ride in one of the convertibles. And Peter said, not me, not me. I want J.B. Jackson, who's very well known in South Dallas as a kind of a radical leader. He said, I want J.B. in the car. And Eric Johnson hated the idea, and it took a long time. Finally, he said, okay, J.B. Jackson can be in the car. So that day of the Cotton Bowl parade, Peter said that as it came down what is now MLK, it was then Forest, he said half the black community of South Dallas was lined up along the route because they had heard that J.B. Jackson was going to be in the parade, and they did not believe it. And so they were there just to see if it was true. And here came J.B., and Peter swears that there were people just weeping, tears in their eyes, to see this kind of recognition, which really takes you back to the terribly sad story of how humiliating did life had to be for that gesture to be that powerful.
Yeah.
And Peter knew what he was doing. Yes?
One of my questions is, I remember in the 80s, and I'm sorry I've forgotten his name, but there was a black man with IBM or something that they paraded around the meetings and stuff. It was like, oh, and when
Yeah.
you mentioned the CEO. And at that time, it occurred to me that a lot of this was class as well as race. This man came dignified, educated, whatever, so he was acceptable in these circles. But, JB would not have been invited.
No. Which is a big issue. There's a big issue now. South Dallas, the old Southern Dallas is in many ways isolated from this new realm all around us that's very diverse. And it does have to do with class. There's another guy whose name I don't remember. There was another person of that type, a black corporate leader, except he was from South Dallas originally and had done very, very well. And his son and daughter-in-law are both attorneys living in Plano. And so he decided he wanted his grandson to see the hood, see where the family came from. So I don't know how old the kid was, but he took him to his barbershop in South Dallas. And there was a lot going on in the barbershop that day. A couple of very able fences came up and offered Grandpa some Brooks Brothers suits, like $50 or something. And the grandson was smart enough to sort of know what was going on. So then he took his grandson back up north to his parents, and his son called him and said, if you ever take our son to South Dallas again, you're just not going to see him. He's never to go there, and he's never to know about that world. And you can be proud of it if you want to, but don't think you're taking our kid down there. So there's that division too.
Well, I always wondered, I just saw that if you came from the right class, you had a better chance of being brought in. And a lot of it just seemed foreshadowed, although this was a really nice man, I don't think he.
Well, Ron Kirk was absolutely from that class, and Ron Kirk was recruited by the business leadership. Kirk was smart enough and cool enough to be able to communicate both ways. He was political. But I remember referring to Marvin Crenshaw in a column I wrote as a community activist. Kirk was mayor, and he sort of buttonholed me in the hall and said, why do you keep calling all these guys community activists? They're just shakedown artists. And I said, well, Mr. Mayor, let me hear you say that on TV. Because these were people who were respected, but they came from poor backgrounds, and they didn't go to college. And yeah, they were unsophisticated in some ways. Probably sharper in other ways than Mr. Kirk. We all have, class divisions aren't unique to black people, are they?
No. Well, my other question then is, so as I read the book, it just, I understood the history and I lived through a lot of that history, but some of it so you could have written it today.
Pardon?
I mean, some of it seemed like you almost could have written it today. I mean, I know that it's a different story, but a lot of it hasn't changed.
Where I've appeared with Commissioner Price, we have a difference of opinion, because people will say, what has changed? And I say, a lot has changed, a huge change. Commissioner Price says, you're being tricked to look at the change, because if you look at certain census tracts in South Dallas, and they're the ones that were marked off, mapped off, redlined by the federal government in the 30s for withholding of mortgage money, but that was the tip of the iceberg. Everything was withheld, mortgage money, water, sewer, cops, everything. Those areas were designated as outside the mainstream American economy and life because black people lived in them. If you look at those census tracts today, some of them are worse in terms of serial incarceration and poverty and literacy and everything. And what Commissioner Price has said, and he's absolutely right, is that if you line up the federal and local governments and all the power in town and you say, we are going to hammer this area, we're going to hammer life here, it works. Lots of people have left those areas. There's been tremendous upward mobility, and they're all out and about. But babies are still born to those areas. And not everybody. If you look at us white folks, we're not all just enormously ingenious and survivalistic. Some of us are just sort of regular folks. Being regular folks in those areas is really tough. And so what Commissioner Price says is, how can we pat ourselves on the back for the change and live in the same city with these internment camps? And I don't think he's wrong.
Well, and the other thought I have is how money still has so much of the power and control.
Yeah.
The developers have never ceased, to change the city their way.
The developers,
Have never ceased changing the city.
oh, no.
I was yesterday, and just horrified. I hadn't been there for a while.
The city council just 14-1 voted to throw out 300 tenants, many of them are families, from apartments over where the Observer headquarters used to be by the old Parkland, which Harlan Crow has done so lavishly that it's weird. And so Harlan Crow bought out these apartments that were zoned multifamily. And the city has been saying for 10 years, oh, we're going to protect housing, and we got to have rental property, and we got to have multifamily. So the council voted 14-1 to rip out all that residential zoning, which will never return, and let Harlan expand the kingdom of Harlan throughout that area. So, yeah, this is, I don't know. I don't know enough about other cities to know if money talks and walks the same way elsewhere than it does here. Here, it's still very dominant. Yes.
Any recommendations for what we can do?
Well, you know what? Every once in a while somebody asks me that. And I want to say, you're asking a retired newspaper reporter this question. I tend, especially in a church setting, to point toward your clergy. they're the people who deal with because these are monumental. All these issues finally come down to moral questions, don't they? No, I don't. Those things are kind of over my head. Yeah.
Jim, that's a great question. One thing that occurred to me, my wife and I, after the George Floyd summer, we looked at our giving, and we we decided our giving, our philanthropic,
Yeah.
philanthropy is a fancy word for the amount of money we give away, but, and we started redirecting it, and one of the places we went to was Paul Quinn College, where we have a church member that works there.
Mhm.
That's an institution that's
Right.
changing the South.
And a really great one, influential, Michael Sorrell has been there, he's interesting. Michael Sorrell, president of Paul Quinn College, back, I guess I was at the Observer, yeah, but he started to get involved in city politics. And then there was a clear moment where he decided, no. I'm gonna find another way to be effective. And he showed up as president of Paul Quinn, and he's just done wonders there. He's a reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yes.
I was gonna say, I'm like you, I'm also optimistic about our young people. I spend a lot of time with my grandchildren and their friends, and, even the ones who, my granddaughter's at Ursuline, and a lot of her friends have very conservative parents, but the girls are not.
No.
The girls are not conservative, they're very liberal, very progressive, they say, Grandma, we can think for ourselves.
Yeah.
That's my hope, is that our young people,
We just had this conversation at dinner, home with some friends, and there was another couple there who went way back in the Park Cities. And I said my thing about how I was so optimistic because of young people. And they I think are pretty liberal. They said, we think the conservative parents still have a pretty good grip on their kids' thinking. I don't know if that's true. The conservative parents must know some magic that we never learned. How you continue to own their heads, but yeah, I got invited to talk at Ursuline this is some time ago, and I still had in my mind rich white girls' school. And I showed up, and the class was so diverse that I was talking to. And diverse in a great way. I mean, knew each other, eyeball to eyeball, peers. Obviously, Ursuline has used its endowment or something to foster that diversity, but I think that's true of a lot of private schools. Some of them are obviously very deliberately not diverse, but a lot of them are very diverse.
Jim, at the time you were writing the book, it seemed like you were placing a lot of faith in a single member district. And I wonder if that's played out the way that you had hoped at that time that it would.
Not exactly. There's something missing from the formula. Because you wind up with a system, because the single members are so powerful, they're like all powerful in their districts, but the mayor is relatively powerless. And so I call it the buck stops nowhere system. There was just an incident, and it was in the paper, about a problem the city has with building permits. And it goes way back. It's this intractable problem. It's really, really difficult, apparently, to get building permits done with any kind of expedition and efficiency. So they're trying to fix that. And the city manager was quoted as saying he didn't think it was a big problem, that the only people who think it's a problem are city council members and the press. And I thought, wow, that's kind of like a grocer saying, the only people who don't like my produce are those customers. It's so phenomenal. It's amazing to me. The city manager is a hired guy. And for him to sort of, and I have a lot of respect for this current one, Rodmax. He's a smart man from the top of the city manager field. But there's this intransigence and arrogance toward elected leadership and toward people and taxpayers So whenever I say I think we need a strong mayor system, people will always say, oh, you mean like Chicago? Well, maybe. Or the other thing people will say is, oh, you mean like Laura Miller? Yeah, definitely. We need somebody we can fire. We need to be able to say as a city, okay, we told you to get the building permits fixed. You didn't get the building permits fixed. Thank you for your service. We're going to try this other person. And instead, we have this system that it's almost impossible to affect beyond your own district. You can get stuff done in your district. We've learned as homeowners, I'm sure everybody here knows, you don't call 311. You don't call planning. You don't call the city manager's office. You call your council member, right? That's the hot button. And that's where the action is. But beyond that, for anything outside your district, it's very difficult for people to move the machine. Yes.
Jim, I heard, the thing I read most recently out of the book was about coalitions. Several people you quoted say the single-member district will work if we learn to put together coalitions.
Coalitions.
Yeah. Have you seen any of that?
Well, over the main course of my journalism career, the big coalition, the most powerful one I saw was between black leadership and the Citizens Council. And I thought, no, when I say coalitions, I meant me. I meant like coalitions with people like me, white progressives. I didn't mean a coalition that left us out. But
Maybe we could jump into some coalitions.
it's tougher than you think.
Yeah.
For a while, I was on the board of Head Start in Greater Dallas when Hispanic leadership was just beginning to be very dissatisfied with how Head Start served the Hispanic community. And their attitude was interesting. It was kind of, we gather that, okay, we're immigrants. We gather that you white people and you black people had a big problem here in the past, and we're very sorry. And we hope you can work it out, but we don't care. We want our kids to read, write, speak English, get jobs, and make money. And so that set of interests is simply very specific. And how exactly, I thought back, wait a minute, I thought the Hispanics and the black people would be a coalition. Why did I think that? What was it that I thought they had in common? Was it color? And I realized, oh yeah, I did think that. I did think that that was some commonality, and exactly why would it be? It's really not. I'm hopeful. Now, another reason I'm optimistic is I think those new kinds of coalitions are about to happen. And I think Hispanic leadership will be a big part of it. Maybe they'll help us get around some of our stuff.
Well, I'm not real big into the city council, but I've been to a couple of meetings, seen you there in the past and stuff. But recently, I read Paul Ridley and two other councilmen. Sounded to me like it got into a coalition, and they got in trouble. So
They got into a...
got into trouble. It had to do with minority bids and bidding and stuff. And I was like, it was a coalition, I swear. It sounded like a coalition. I was pleased, and then I read it was trouble.
Yeah. It's really complex, and especially when you get into the business of contracting.
Yeah.
That's the other lesson I learned, that yeah, there's race, there's philosophy, there's morality, there's all that stuff. Then there's the contracts.
Right.
And they're really important.
Any last question?
Thanks so much. Great.
Oh,
I knew I'd get great questions here, and you were wonderful, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for coming. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm really pleased. Thank you so much, Jim. We enjoyed reading your book enormously. So glad that